As believers in Jesus Christ, we often hear the admonition not to love the world. This is certainly an important warning, and there are many different verses that could be quoted that help support this statement. If we are going to avoid this tendency in our lives, then it is important that we understand what loving the world looks like. We often associate worldliness with living a sinful lifestyle driven by the desires that this world can give us. Popularity, wealth, pleasures. It reminds me of the old Schlitz beer slogan that says, "You only go around once in life, so you got to grab for all the gusto you can." Although this does describe a worldly life, I would propose to you that a love for the world can show itself in much more subtle ways. As believers in Jesus Christ, we often tend to deceive ourselves to think that we no longer struggle with the pull of the world. However, anyone who is honest knows this is not the case. I want you to think and ponder this statement. As Christians, we will always struggle with the propensity to love the world. Let me state that again. As Christians, we will always struggle with the propensity to love the world. As long as we live in these sinful bodies, this struggle will exist. What makes me say this? Well, let me share a passage of Scripture with you. The Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy concludes his letter with a plea for Timothy to come to him as soon as he could. Why did he want him to come? Well, the first reason he gives can be found in chapter 4, verse 10. And this is what Paul says, "For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica." A little background is in order here. The Apostle Paul had been arrested a second time and was brought back to Rome, where he awaited trial and execution. Paul's second imprisonment was unlike his first. He was not under house arrest where he enjoyed certain freedoms, but rather this second imprisonment he was actually placed in a prison. Paul's life on earth was soon to end. However, he had one final chance to write a letter to Timothy. In reference to Demas, little is known of this man. He is mentioned in Paul's letters to the Colossians and Philemon. He is one of several men who apparently assisted the apostle in his ministry. It is telling that Demas is mentioned as in two of the prison epistles that Paul wrote during his first imprisonment in Rome. This is somewhat speculative, but Demas was seemingly a faithful companion and disciple of Paul, and was willing to associate with the apostle during his first imprisonment. So what changed? A common theme that we see in 2 Timothy revolves around a willingness to suffer for Christ. Paul was writing his final words to Timothy from a dark, dank prison cell, and what did he want to communicate? He makes several statements to Timothy throughout the letter, like, "Do not be ashamed, Timothy. Endure hardships, Timothy. Be willing to suffer persecution, Timothy. Endure afflictions, Timothy." The reality for Paul that he was suffering just like Jesus did, and anyone who associated with Jesus, whether it was Paul, Timothy, or Demas, would suffer a similar fate. For Demas, the pressure had become too great. In times past, he was willing to stand by Paul, but at the time that it would have possibly cost him his life, he abandoned the apostle. You know, this is amazing to me. Demas's temptation was not worldly pleasures, but rather a fear of the ultimate sacrifice that he would have to make. However, Paul still identifies Demas's motives as being a love for the present world. This tells us that the pull of the world shows itself in many different and unique ways depending on the individual. For Demas, it was a desire to preserve his life, but for you it could be something totally different. For those who have been saved from a life of addiction, it may be the temptation to fall back into that lifestyle. For others, it may be family allegiance that pulls them away from following the Lord. And yet for others, it may simply be the pull for temporary pleasures that this world offers. Regardless of what it might be, a love for the world can be boiled down into a conflict between pleasing and preserving ourselves and a willingness to forsake all for the Lord. As we mature spiritually, a love for the world will not go away, but the temptations will be more subtle and harder to identify. So my challenge to you is to learn from the example of Demas. First, do you realize that a love for the world will always be something you struggle with? Second, can you honestly identify right now in your life what aspects of the world pull you away from faithfully following the Lord? Once we realize that we will always struggle with the temptation to love the world, we can then be on the lookout for the ways that this tendency shows itself in our lives. The Lord is faithful to reveal this to us, and we can then press forward and be used by Him more faithfully. We can take great comfort in knowing that the Lord realizes our struggles and enables us to change.